Hello everyone, it's Andrew, and today we're going to read the book History Smashers, Pearl Harbor by Kate Messner. You've probably heard the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, is one of the most infamous events in American history. Maybe you've heard stories about that day, how the attack was a total surprise, with no warning whatsoever, how it lit up the morning sky on December 7th, 1941, devastated the American fleet in the Pacific, and created immediate support for the United States to jump into World War II. But only parts of that story are true. When we look closely at documents from that time period, other parts come crashing down. Here's the real deal about the not such a total surprise attack that eventually led the United States into the Second World War, along with some important but not so well-known stories about what happened next. Chapter 1. War Overseas. People often tell the story of Pearl Harbor as if the Japanese attack in Hawaii happened completely out of the blue. No warning and nothing suggests that there might be trouble. In reality, there were plenty of warning signs. But to understand how the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, we need to go back in time a little bit. Sometimes Americans think of 1941 as the beginning of World War II, but that's just when the United States got involved. The war had actually started 2 years earlier, in September of 1939. That's when the Nazi Germany invaded Poland. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later. This is a photo of Germany invading Poland. It wasn't long before the war took over Europe. Between April and June of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and even took over France. In June, Germany picked up some help from Italy, which declared war on Great Britain and France. And in July, Germany started bombing Great Britain. Sounds complicated, doesn't it? That's what most Americans thought too. Back when all this was happening, at the time, many people in the United States were in favor of a policy called isolationism, which basically means minding your own business. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was concerned about the situation, but he understood that most Americans didn't want to go to war after World War I. The U.S. government sent supplies to Great Britain, but refused to send troops, even though Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill had asked for help. Roosevelt had made a promise to the American people. "We will not participate in foreign wars and will not send our army, naval, or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack." But that promise got harder and harder to keep. Germany wasn't the only country trying to take over other nations. Japan was also doing the same thing. For 2 centuries, Japan had kept itself an isolated island nation. That started to change in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry led a U.S. expedition into what is now called Tokyo Bay, trying to open up Japanese to trade with other nations. By the 1920s, Japan was deeply involved in trade with other countries. It used some of the money that brought in to build a naval air force. Then, Japan's military leaders decided it was time to expand the empire by taking more land. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, an area in northeast China. By 1937, it had launched a full-scale invasion into China. That was even before World War II began. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese people were killed, and the United States sent millions of dollars to relief funds to China, but refused to get involved in the fighting. When Germany started invading all those other countries in Europe, Japanese military leaders decided to grab even more territory. Since most of Europe, like France and Britain, were busy fighting the Nazis, it seemed like a perfect time for Japan to invade French Indochina, the part of East Asia that now includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. American leaders worried that the Philippines, then under U.S. control, might be next. Colonialism. Right about now, you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, what are countries like France and the United States doing in East Asia anyway? The answer to that question has to do with colonialism. That's a policy of taking over other countries, sending settlers, and using those countries' natural resources. European nations, and later the United States, engaged in practice throughout history. That's why so many people in East Asia weren't in charge of their own lands back then. The US had taken control of the Philippines from Spain in a war in 1898. And why did Spain have the Philippines to begin with? Because explorer Ferdinand Magellan had landed there in 1521. So Spain could take it from the people who lived there. I claim this island for the King of Spain! Spain and other nations that engaged in colonialism often justified by saying that they weren't actually helping the people who lived there by converting them to Christianity. It's probably no surprise that the people being invaded didn't appreciate that kind of help. Interestingly enough, Japan also claimed it was helping when it launched its invasions in the 1930s by freeing people from that old colonialism. But like the invaders who had come before, what the Japanese really wanted was that moolah, that natural resources. With Japan showing no signs of stopping, President Roosevelt decided it was time for America to make a show of force. In 1940, he ordered American Pacific Fleet, which had been stationed in San Diego, California, to Hawaii. The ships crossed the ocean and settled in at Pearl Harbor Naval Base in the island of Oahu. It was meant to be a threat. Roosevelt thought moving the powerful fleet so close to Japan would show that the United States was ready to take action quickly if needed. Japan wouldn't want to tangle with America's powerful military. Right? But that plan didn't really work out. By September of 1940, Japan was occupying northern French Indochina. Japan also signed a deal with Germany and Italy that month. The three nations called their agreement the Tripartite Pact. It promised that if any of those countries were attacked, the other two would defend it. Simple. It's friendship. Just a country friendship. And that brings us to 1941, the year Pearl Harbor attack. The year of the Pearl Harbor attack. The war in Europe was still going strong. In July, Japan sent troops into southern French Indochina. Southern French Indochina was close to the Philippines, and US leaders worried that Japan might use it as a new position to stage attack. Trying to prevent that, the United States cut off oil and iron exports to Japan. But that just created even more tension. Most Americans still didn't want to get involved in any of this mess overseas, but it looked more and more that the nations might be headed for war. The history of Hawaii. Pearl Harbor is remembered in history books as a terrible attack on American soil. But the truth is, in 1941, Hawaii hadn't been part of America for so long. It was only 43 years earlier that the United States had taken the islands. Hawaii's first settlers were Polynesian farmers and fishermen. Historians believe that they crossed in oceans in canoes, arriving as early as 400 or 500 CE. For hundreds of years, they lived in small communities ruled by chieftains. In 1778, English sea captain James Cook showed up on the island of Kau. His arrival marked the beginning of change. With the help of Western weapons and advice, one of the island's chiefs, Kamehameha, was able to defeat other rulers, gain power, and unite the islands under his rule. King Kamehameha is still honored as Hawaii's first king, with celebrations each June. My apologies if I pronounced it incorrectly. The first Christian missionaries arrived in the Hawaiian Islands in 1820. These were white people who came from New England because they wanted to convert Hawaiian people to their religion. Along with their Bibles, they brought diseases that wiped out most of Hawaii's native population. When Cook first landed in the islands, at least 300,000 and perhaps more than 500,000 native Hawaiians lived there. Less than 100 years later, that number had dropped to 70,000 or less. Meanwhile, white settlers interested in growing sugar brought lots and lots of land from Hawaiian people who had little money. A group of white businessmen made a plan for America to take over the islands. In 1887, that group, the Hawaiian League, forced Hawaii's King Kalakaua to sign a new constitution at gunpoint. That document took away much of the king's power. It gave voting rights to foreign landowners and took rights away from thousands of people in Asian ancestry who lived in Hawaii for years. A few years later, American colonists controlled the island's sugar industry, overthrowing the native leader. The United States officially annexed or took over Hawaii in 1898. Chapter 2 is coming up next. I hope you all enjoyed reading this book with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye!